Welcome back to another VATSIM 101 video where we're going to be talking about SIDs and STARs. On almost any IFR flight you're going to do, you're going to fly some sort of a SID or a STAR, particularly if you are operating at larger, more complex airports. First, we're going to talk about what they are, and then we're going to take a look at some charts and figure out exactly what is expected of us when we fly these routes. So firstly, let's talk about what a SID and a STAR is. A SID is a standard instrument departure, and a STAR is a standard terminal arrival route. They are charted routes that help the flow of traffic arriving or departing from certain airports. A lot of them are going to have speed and altitude restrictions that you are going to be expected to maintain. They're going to have several different transition points, and transitions are where you're going to either enter a STAR or depart from a SID. They may be specific to a runway that you're using or a direction of flight that you are going to be traveling. There are three different types of SIDs and STARs that you are going to see: radar vector, pilot nav, and hybrid. The differences between the three different types of SIDs and STARs is relatively straightforward. Radar vector SIDs and STARs are going to be entirely controlled by ATC. So they are going to give you headings to fly and certain altitudes to maintain in order to get you to a specified fix or airport. This allows ATC to have more control over the traffic in their airspace. Pilot nav SIDs and STARs are going to be charted routes that pilots are going to follow to their transition or to the airport they are arriving to. Most of them are going to have speed and altitude restrictions that you are going to need to maintain. This alleviates a lot of workflow from both pilots and air traffic controllers, mostly because both the pilots and the controllers know exactly what they need to do and what route they're going to be following. Hybrid SIDs and STARs are a combination of the two. These are usually going to be found at busier, more complex airports where ATC needs some sort of flow control very close to the airport. But there will also be a charted route that pilots will fly up to a certain point. Hybrid SIDs and STARs tend to trip up a lot of newer pilots on the VATSIM network for reasons we're going to talk about here in a little bit. So if you are flying on a hybrid procedure, just make sure you're reading it carefully to ensure that you're doing exactly what is expected. When it comes to choosing a SID or a STAR, the easiest way is to use a flight planning tool to help you figure it out. Flight planning tools like SimBrief or SkyVector or ForeFlight, for example, will take into account the type of plane that you are using along with your direction of flight. It will then pick the best departure or arrival route for you. If you want to try your hand at choosing a SID or a STAR yourself, you'll first want to determine what your direction of flight is going to be. Your direction of departure for a SID and your direction of arrival for a STAR. You'll then want to figure out what runway you're going to be using for departure and arrival. Remember, some SIDs and STARs are specific to the runway that you're going to be using. The last thing you want to make sure is that the plane that you are operating is equipped to fly that SID or STAR. When it comes to entering a STAR into an FMS, some pilots get tripped up because there could be multiple runways that the airport is using for their arrival. A really great example of this is Atlanta Airport, where you could either be landing on runway 26 right, 27 left, or 28. And some planes will not allow you to enter the STAR without selecting which runway you're going to be landing on. In those cases, you just want to select the most likely runway that you are going to be using. Something that I see a lot of pilots do to try and get ahead is to ask the center controller before they start their descent what runway the airport is using. The center controller is not going to know a specific runway. They may be able to tell you what direction the airport is landing in, but the specific runway that you're going to use comes down to the approach controller. So in those cases, select the most likely runway that you think you're going to land on. That way you can get the entire STAR loaded in. If the runway you do does change, it's not hard for you to go back in and reload the approach in for the proper runway, but that center controller is not going to be able to help you in that instant. Now let's talk about every VATSIM controller's favorite subject: flight plan discontinuities. Every single VATSIM controller watching this video just collectively rolled their eyes. Despite what you may have been told on the tutorial that you watched for your plane, flight plan discontinuities are not inherently a bad thing. They are going to appear when there is a radar vector leg on your SID or your STAR. What the flight plan discontinuity is telling you is that the FMS is receiving conflicting information. They will often have a specified track for you to fly before that discontinuity, along with a fix that's going to come after that discontinuity. So in the first example we have on an Airbus FMS, this is for the Bodega 4 arrival into San Francisco. The last fix on the Bodega 4 is Bricks. After Bricks, you're going to fly a track of 140 degrees to expect radar vectors to your final approach course. And that's what it's telling us right here. You can see bricks. Right beneath it, you can see bricks 140, which is the track you're going to fly, and then manual right underneath it, meaning that it's going to be a manual leg. Beneath that, you're going to see flight plan discontinuity. Beneath that, you're going to see SID, which is the initial approach fix. So what this flight plan discontinuity is telling us is the plane knows it needs to fly to bricks and then fly a track of 140 degrees, but it also needs to fly to SID. If the plane continues to fly 140 degrees, it's never going to get to SID. It'll go right past it and fly off into the sunset. So what it's telling us is, hey, I don't know how you want me to get to SID if I got to fly 140 degrees from bricks, so you're going to have to figure it out for me. Do not, for the love of God, please, do not delete flight plan discontinuities out of your flight plan, especially in circumstances like this. If you were to delete that flight plan discontinuity, once you get to bricks, the plane is going to start a turn towards SID, and that's when the controller is going to ask you why you're starting that turn. And most pilots that I see, when they get into that situation, their response is that their autopilot is not doing something correctly or their FMS is screwing up. The FMS and the autopilot system are doing exactly what you told it to do. You just might not understand why it's doing it. So in instances like this, you do not want to delete your flight plan discontinuities. The FMS beneath this one is off of a Boeing 747, so it's not going to show a flight plan discontinuity, it's going to show vectors. Personally, I like the Boeing one a little bit better because you see vectors and you know, oh, okay, I'm going to expect radar vectors to my final approach course, and most people are going to leave that in there. It's the same way of showing a discontinuity, but it's in a much cleaner way. Moral of the story, do not delete flight plan discontinuities until you confirm that it is something that is not needed. So let's take a look at some departure charts, and I promise you these are not nearly as complicated to read as they may appear. So before we start looking at any of these charts, we want to make sure that we're looking at the right airport and we're looking at the right chart. So if we come up to the very top of the chart, we're going to see KLAS, which is McCarran, Harry Reid International Airport, and it's the Gidget 2 RNAV departure for all runways. So on top of making sure that you're looking at the correct procedure, you want to make sure it's compatible with the runway that you intend on using. If we zoom out a little bit and come back over to the left-hand side, at the very top left, you're going to see that there is a departure control frequency for us to contact. Now, keep in mind that you want to make sure that the frequency that you're going to be using is appropriate for your flight. There may be instances where that particular departure frequency is not going to be available for you to use. So always make sure you're on whatever frequency is appropriate for your flight. To the right of that, we have the airport elevation, which is 2,181 feet, and our transition altitude is 18,000 feet. If you're ever not sure what transition altitude applies for the country that you're flying in, the SIDs and the STARs are going to be a great resource for you to reference. Right up at the top middle, we have the equipment requirements for the plane that we're using. So at the very top, the plane has to be RNAV1 capable, and we either need to have 2 DMEs and an IRU or a GPS in order to fly this departure. Now, most planes that you're going to use are going to have either an INS or a GNSS system, which is much more sophisticated than both of these types of equipment that are listed. If you're not sure whether or not your plane has that system, you can consult the developer's manual for the plane, and it will tell you what equipment is on board. Just underneath that, we have 2 different sets of parameters. Number 1, radar required. That's more of an ATC thing. That's not particularly something that we as pilots have to worry about. And number 2, this SID is for turbojets only. So if you are flying a propeller aircraft of any type, you will not be able to fly this SID. You will need to find another one that you can use. So we'll zoom out here and take a look at the actual chart itself. So we'll start down towards the airport. So you can see what path we fly once we take off is largely dependent on what runway we're going to be using. This is an example of a pilot nav SID because we're not going to be getting any direction from air traffic control. We are going to take off and immediately start tracking all of the fixes that we are going to need to fly to. You're going to see that there are some blue and red numbers that are on this chart. Blue numbers are your altitude restrictions. Red numbers are your speed restrictions. Your speed restrictions are going to be an indicated airspeed. So the first restriction we'll take a look at is AVA, right down here. So you're going to see AVA has 6,000 above that line. So if your altitude is above that line, it means you need to be at or above that altitude. So when we cross AVA, we need to be at or above 6,000 feet. If we take a look at Leland right over here, you're going to see 8,000 feet beneath that line. So if the altitude is beneath that line, that means we need to be at or below that altitude. So when we cross Leland, we need to be at or below 8,000 feet. Next, let's take a look at Aero. So Aero is right over here. So we have an altitude restriction of at or above 11,500 feet, but we also have a speed restriction at a max of 250 knots. So we cannot fly faster than 250 knots until we cross Aero. Speed restrictions are relatively straightforward. It's either going to give you a maximum airspeed, a minimum airspeed, or an at airspeed. So now we'll drag the chart a little bit over further to the right at Gidget. Now you'll see all of these different flight paths converge at Gidget, and then from there, depending on what transition you're flying, determines what direction you're going to travel. We have Virkin, and we have Tucker. So if you were flying the Virkin transition, you would fly from Gidget to Geo, to Bethel, then out to Virkin, then from Virkin, you would transition off of the SID onto your flight plan route. And if you were flying the Tucker transition, you would fly from Gidget to Nicole, and then out to Tucker, transition off of the SID onto your flight plan route. You're going to see some other numbers that are also going to be important. So the first one we'll go over is this number right here. We have 21.6, and then right beneath that, we have 22.5. That is the distance between two fixes. From Tia to Gidget is 21.6 nautical miles, and from Arrow to Gidget, it's 22.5 nautical miles. The next set of numbers you'll see after Gidget are 53 degrees and 71 degrees. That is the track that you are going to fly coming off of that fix. So when you fly from Gidget to Geo, you're going to fly a track of 53 degrees. If you're flying from Gidget to Nicole, it's going to be a track of 71 degrees. So it just helps keep you oriented. The next set of numbers that you'll see are right here. So we have 33.5, which is our distance from Gidget to Geo. Then beneath that, you're going to see 15,000 and 9,000 with a T at the end of it. The 15,000 is your minimum en route altitude. That's really the lowest altitude that you're going to want to be at when you're flying from Gidget to Geo. The 9,000 with a T at the end of it means that is the minimum obstruction clearance altitude, or your MOCA, which is going to guarantee you clearance from any terrain that's around you, but you may not be able to receive the signal to keep you on track to your next fix. If you can help it, you want to be at or above that minimum en route altitude to ensure you're receiving the signal to track those fixes. The last thing I'll bring to your attention are these right here. So we have Virkin with Gidget2.Virkin, and then Tucker, Gidget2.Tucker. That's just telling you that is the route you're going to fly for those respective transitions. Now, if we scroll down lower on this chart, there is going to be a text box that's going to tell us what we're supposed to do for each one of these runways we could be departing on. So if you're looking at the graphic and you're getting a little confused and you're not really sure what's going on because it's a big ball of spaghetti that splits off in 100 different directions, you can look at what runway you're using and then it will break it down for you. So let's say we were taking off on runway 26 left. We would climb on a heading of 259 degrees to 2,682 feet, then fly direct to Leland to cross Leland at or below 8,000 feet. Then on track 336 degrees to cross Glean at or above 5,000 feet and at or below 230 knots. Then on track 50 degrees to cross back at or above 6,000 feet. Then on track 58 degrees to cross Aloli at or above 7,000 feet. Then on track 79 degrees to cross Tia at or above 14,000 feet. Then on track 79 degrees to Gidget. From there, the routing down below, from Gidget on transition. So that means we're just going to fly on whatever transition it is that we are going to be flying after we cross Gidget. Maintain flight level 190 and expect filed altitude 10 minutes after departure. So this is something that a lot of pilots also miss too, and that's why I always encourage you to look at these text boxes before you start flying these SIDs, because nowhere on this chart does it tell us that there is an altitude restriction of 19,000 feet that we cannot climb past. But down here, it does tell us that. So over here on the right-hand side, we have our top altitude of flight level 190, and then it also gives it to us right here. So this means that we can climb up to flight level 190 without ATC intervention as long as we are abiding by all of the other restrictions along the SID. Always check to see what your top altitude is whenever you're flying these procedures. The last thing I want to go over here is the climb gradients, because these are going to be different performance requirements based on what part of the star that you're on. So you're going to see on the left-hand side, it'll say 204 feet per nautical mile, 271 per nautical mile. So what that means is that they want you to climb 204 feet for every nautical mile forward you fly. And then at the very top, we have the different ground speeds that we're flying at. So for example, if we had a ground speed of 200 knots and we needed a climb gradient of 286 feet per nautical mile, we would need to climb at least the 953 per minute, which for every turbojet aircraft you're going to fly is not going to be a problem. That's the performance requirement depending on what part of this procedure you're on. This chart is the Orca 5 departure coming out of Los Angeles. We're not going to go through everything here. I just wanted to show you an example of what a hybrid SID looks like. So if we come down to the Los Angeles airport, we're going to see that this departure is for planes taking off from the west. So if we're taking off on runway 24 left, we're going to fly direct to Delray, at or below 3,000 feet. And then this down here, this big arrow with all those little arrows that come after it, means that we are going to expect radar vectors from air traffic control to our first fix, which is going to be right here at Clipper. I know that's kind of confusing to see, but Clipper is going to be that first fix. This is where you're going to start seeing flight plan discontinuities. So in this example, your FMS is going to say Delray and then some kind of track. It doesn't say specifically what track this is going to be. Then it's going to say manual, flight plan discontinuity, and then Clipper. So this is where you don't want to delete that flight plan discontinuity, because if you cross Delray and that flight plan discontinuity is not in there, it's going to start turning towards Clipper. So you want to make sure that flight plan discontinuity stays in there, so that way when you cross Delray, you are maintaining that track you're supposed to until the air traffic controller tells you to fly to that first fix. This departure is the O'Hare 8 coming out of Chicago O'Hare International Airport, and you're going to see that there are no charted routes that we are going to be following. Instead, we see a whole lot of fixes out here. So for example, we can see fixes like E-Bake up here, then we have Earn down here, then there's some more out here. So these are the fixes that air traffic control is going to give us radar vectors to. When we are given our takeoff clearance, the controller is going to tell us to fly a certain heading, and then once we're handed off to the departure controller is going to give us more headings to fly to get us to whatever fix it is that we are going to be transitioning off of the departure. Now, it's important to know that with departures like this, you may see a flight plan discontinuity. Other times, the FMS may draw a route directly to that first fix. So just make sure you're keeping track of that and flying the heading that you're supposed to rather than flying directly to that first fix. Next, I want to show you some departures coming out of Charles de Gaulle in Paris. So if we look at the actual charts themselves, you're going to see that we have the Atrex, Nermo, and Opale 5 departures, and then just different iterations of each one. You have the Alpha and the Delta variants. And these departures are going to be for runways 27 left and right. So this is specific to 2 runways at the airport. If we come over to the next chart that I have here, you're going to see that we're still using the same fixes for the departures, Atrex, Nermo, and Opale, but they are going to be Bravo and Echo variants of the charts, and they are going to be for runways 26 left and right. So they're going to have the same fixes for the transitions, but they are for 2 sets of entirely different runways. So when you're selecting the SID that you want to use, make sure it is compatible with the runway that you intend on using. Next, we'll take a look at a couple of stars, and we're not going to break them all down bit by bit like we did with the departure coming out of Las Vegas, because there are a lot of parallels between SIDs and stars, so the way you read the charts is not too much different. But I do want to show you an example of what a pilot nav star is going to look like. So you can see there are several different transitions that we could fly on this arrival depending on which direction we are approaching from. But they are all going to lead us down to the San Diego airport way over on the lower left-hand side of the chart. Now, at the very end of this arrival, we have Lindy. So there's a speed and altitude restriction at Lindy, and it says expect RNAV runway 27 or localizer 27 approach. So the approach controller is going to tell us which approach we're going to fly, and then from Lindy, we're going to fly directly to the initial approach fix. We're not going to get any radar vectors or any other instructions from air traffic control. We are going to be expected to fly from Lindy to that initial approach fix. The next difference I want to show you are some of these altitude restrictions that are on here. So at Jack and Helix, you're going to see 2 different sets of altitude restrictions. So if we look at Helix, we have 15,000 and 12,000 between 2 lines. So this means that we need to be in between those 2 altitudes when we cross Helix. If you were to break this up individually, we would need to be at or below 15,000 feet and at or above 12,000 feet. So as long as we are in between those 2 altitudes, we will be in compliance with that crossing restriction. The next chart we're going to take a look at is the Jonesy 5 coming into Charlotte. And as you can see, there's really only one direction that you can fly on this arrival. It's when you're coming from the southwest of the airport. But you'll notice once you get to Jonesy, there are 2 different directions that you can go depending on what runway you're going to land on. So if we were landing to the north on runways 3, 6 left, center, or right at Charlotte, we would go from Jonesy to Dub, and then out to Shell. From Shell, we would then expect radar vectors to our final approach course. If we were going to be landing on runway 18 left, center, and right, we would fly from Jonesy out along this depicted path and end at Jordan, and again, expect radar vectors to our final approach course. This is another example of when you can see a flight plan discontinuity, because after Jordan, the plane knows it needs to turn around and land on runway 18 left, center, and right, but it also knows it needs to keep a track to the north and until we tell it to do something else. So another example of you're not going to want to delete that flight plan discontinuity after Jordan or after Shell because the air traffic controllers are going to be telling you what to do next. The last set of charts we're going to take a look at are more runway-specific charts. So this is coming into Dubai International Airport. This chart is the DATAB 1 Echo arrival. That's going to be for runways 12 left and right. If we take a look at the DATAB 3 Charlie and the DATAB 4 Delta, you're going to see it's a completely different route that we're going to be flying because it's for runways 30 left and right. So those are going to have the same name, but have different number designations depending on what runway you're going to be using. So always make sure you're reading that carefully before you start plugging it in to your FMS. And that'll wrap up today's VATSIM 101 lesson, everybody. If there's anything that you can take away from this video, please do not delete those flight plan discontinuities. They are not a bad thing. I know they're scary to look at, but I promise you they're there for a good reason, and it's going to keep you out of trouble. If you do have any questions about today's video, feel free to pop them in the comments section below. And until next time, everybody, this is Cross Hyperu, signing out.